Solitary confinement is not cruel and unusual punishment. First, we will take a look at the history of solitary confinement. Solitary confinement in the past. According to the corrections scholar Hans Tosh, the techniques observed in solitary confinement are not new. These techniques have repeatedly been adopted and abandoned in the past. During most of the 20th century, the U.S. courts had a hands-off doctrine when it came to the conditions of solitary confinement. They left the decisions regarding conditions of confinement to the prison authorities' discretion. In the 1960s and 1970s, the conditions of confinement were held to violate the Eighth Amendment. This led to significant reforms. In the 1970s and 1980s, there was an increase in conservatism. Rehabilitation programs for inmates appeared to be ineffective, so a get-tough approach towards crime control was adopted, emphasizing incapacitation and punishment. The result was mandatory sentencing policies dramatically increased prison populations in solitary confinement in the U.S. There are many court cases that we found on cruel and unusual punishment. Here are two of them. The first is Estelle v. Gamble. The U.S. Supreme Court defined the types of conditions that violate cruel and unusual punishment clause of the Eighth Amendment. According to Justice Thurgood Marshall, he concluded punishments which are incompatible with the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society, or which involve the unnecessary and wanton infliction of pain. The next one, it stated that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the conditions in the Arkansas penal system violated the 8th and 14th Amendments. The state of Arkansas had appealed the lower court's order that placed a maximum limit of 30 days on solitary confinement or punitive isolation. The district court's order was upheld, but the responsibility of examining the circumstances for individual cases to determine whether they were cruel and unusual punishment was left to each reviewing court. Solitary confinement in the contemporary era. Solitary confinement comes in the form of supermax or supermaximum security facilities. The first supermax facility was developed in Illinois. The facility enhanced security and total control procedures to isolate and segregate problematic inmates who could not be around other inmates or staff. In 1983, 2 inmates were murdered in a feud with a gang. While one of the murderers, shackled and handcuffed, was being escorted back to his control unit, he broke away and was handed an improvised knife, with which he repeatedly stabbed and killed an officer. The murderer's accomplice killed another officer hours later in the same fashion. These murders that took place at the federal prison in Illinois led to a modernization of total control units within facilities. There's a side note here. While there are some eras where there is very little mention of solitary confinement, prisons have always maintained designated space to segregate problematic inmates. The pros of using solitary confinement are that solitary confinement can provide protection for prisoners from general populations such as high-risk offenders and other dangerous prisoners, and it also makes it more difficult for these prisoners to harm others or vice versa. It is also another way for prison guards to discipline prisoners. Without punishment, it would be extremely difficult for the prison guards to maintain order in the prison. We will now look at the use of solitary confinement. What entails solitary confinement? The term solitary confinement is pretty self-explanatory. It means there is a removal from social interaction. The use of solitary confinement can occur from serious infractions to more minor infractions. Some more serious infractions could include becoming physically violent with inmates and other officers, and more minor infractions could include talking back to officers or disobeying prison orders. Sentences in solitary confinement differ based on severity. There's punitive segregation, which is a maximum of 30 days served, and these are typically used when prison rules have been violated, and administrative segregation, which there is a minimum of 30 days served, and these are typically used for those with an assault history or mental health disorder in the prisons. So why do we use solitary confinement? There has been a continuous increase in violent deviance and mental illness. Solitary confinement is used as a proactive strategy to remove violent inmates from the environment prior to escalating into a dangerous situation. According to a study done by the National Institute of Justice that was done in 2012, the mental health of most inmates who served 1 year in confinement did not change. It found that 20% of psychological well-being improved, 7% of psychological well-being decreased, and 73% of psychological well-being remained the same. We are not in their shoes. The ability to precipitously manage a disruptive, volatile, and violent environment is not executed flippantly and cannot be controlled by those who do not walk in the shoes of the men and women in this profession. Most of us do not work in an environment filled with deviance and physical aggression. If you were in the presence of a person who was an immediate threat to everyone, and there was no possibility of physically restraining the individual, more than likely the easiest route to take would be isolating them. Think of a toddler throwing toys or throwing a tantrum. What is the typical response? A timeout. Timeout involves sitting that child away from the social interactions, and you could say that solitary confinement is the adult version of a timeout. Guidance on solitary confinement. The National Commission on Correctional Health Care issued a position statement to guide correctional health professionals in addressing solitary confinement. Examples of those guidelines include the following. Solitary confinement as an administrative method of maintaining security should be used only as an exceptional measure when other less restrictive options are not available, and then the inmate should serve the shortest time possible. Individuals in solitary confinement are entitled to health care like all other inmates. Appropriate programs should be available to individuals in confinement to assist with transition to other housing units. Healthcare providers should evaluate individuals upon placement and after solitary confinement. Healthcare staff should be involved in the determination of whether adults and juveniles are mentally and physically able to be placed in isolation. Principles in medical confidentiality must be observed for those in isolation. Patients should be examined without restraints in the presence of correctional staff unless in the event of high-risk violence. In situations of high-risk violence, the patient's privacy, dignity, and confidentiality will be maintained as much as possible. When correctional staff is present, they will remain at a distance that allows auditory privacy. Now we'll focus on the counter-argument. There are many opposing opinions counter to our argument that are listed in our book on page 155. These arguments are as listed. It states that segregated housing has conditions that are inhumane, is not just for the most violent, is not used as a last resort, is not only used for short amounts of time, it results in harmful effects both physically and psychologically, does not keep jails and prisons any safer, does not deter violence and misbehavior of the inmates, is not the only way to protect those who are vulnerable. Alternatives are not expensive, so why not use them? Incarcerated people are released directly from segregated housing into the community. Many of these explanations are listed here, so the conditions are inhumane. In our book, it states that the conditions are inhumane because of the characteristics of the cell shape. The author describes this space as very small, harsh lights that are on 24/7. There aren't any windows in these cells. They are allowed out only for 1 hour a day, and the social interaction they receive is very limited and scarce. Segregated housing is not just used for violent prisoners. The article states that a large percentage of those who are put into confinement are those who disobey orders from correctional officers. In other words, it is used as a punishment tool for smaller offenses. It is also used to help the vulnerable population, mentally ill, and former public officials stay safe. It is not used as a last resort. Confinement is the first result to punish or protect those in general population instead of using the alternative sanctions many jurisdictions already have. It is not used for a short period of time. People can be put into confinement for days and even years. It can result in harmful physical and psychological effects. Research shows that it results in hypersensitivity to stimuli, distortions and hallucinations, increased anxiety and nervousness, diminishes impulse control, and many other different complications that solitary confinement can have on other people. Segregation does not keep jails and prisons any safer because it does not deter violence and misbehavior from other prisoners. Both of these topics have been researched before, and they found that research has not been used enough to claim that segregation does protect and deter other prisoners. It is not the only way to protect those who are vulnerable, because there are alternatives that are not as expensive as segregation. Instead of using confinement, use alternatives such as separate housing units to house those who are vulnerable. This way, they can receive their protection without harmful effects. These alternatives are not as expensive as keeping them in segregated housing. Incarcerated people are released directly from segregated housing into the community. Research claims that when prisoners are released directly into the community, it raises rates of recidivism. I did a little additional research to counteract those arguments against ours. What I found on corrections.utah.gov is a description of what the solitary confinement facilities look like in our Draper prison. It states the building is capable of housing 96 inmates. Inmates are single-celled, meaning that they do not have cellmates. Unlike traditional depictions of solitary confinement, inmates housed in this area can communicate with one another through the doors of their cells. Each cell has a window that provides natural light, and inmates have the opportunity to recreate either indoors in a common area or outdoors on a concrete pad confined by side walls and chain-link fencing overhead. Like inmates in other facilities, privilege levels vary based on behavior. Nearly all inmates in this section have the ability to earn greater privileges and transition to other areas over time by demonstrating positive behavior. As we can see, many prisons are changing the way they operate solitary confinement so that it is not considered cruel and unusual punishment. Some additional counterpoints that were brought up in our book on page 170. It talks about how little research has been done to prove the points listed against our argument. But a recent study by the National Institute of Justice done in 2012 that was also mentioned earlier in this presentation found that the psychological health of someone in isolation did not deteriorate during the course of a year. The last argument the book makes is putting theory to practice. It states that there are many social problems that are transported into the jails, and they have no way of providing for each problem. Right now, the best thing jails and administration can do is to improve the conditions and try to incorporate more alternative means. If you have any questions about our research, please refer to these sources. If you have any questions, we'd be more than happy to answer them in the discussion. Thank you so much, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation.